Hi, I'm Gary Habermas. I am a distinguished research professor at the School of Divinity at Liberty University, Lynchburg, Virginia.
Dr. Gary Habermas, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking, your first appearance with us.
Yes, glad to be here.
We've been up and running for 6 seasons now, and we're so glad that you've joined us. And we're going to talk a little bit about 1 Corinthians 15 in a minute. But before we do that, I'd love to kind of get your sense about how you got started reading biblical languages. So how'd you do it?
Well, I'm no biblical language specialist or scholar, to be sure, but I went through a long period of doubt, and the resurrection became the answer to my doubts. Right behind that, I realized that if I'm going to study the resurrection, it's one thing to read all the English sources, but how in the world can I really deal with resurrection if I don't have some languages? So when I was in college, I minored in Greek. That's about all I did. I had 16 hours of Greek. It is lasted in good stead for the rest of my career. It's enough to keep me going and hopefully to read the sources and be able to read the text and carry on that way just from 16 hours.
Well, I mean, that's how you get started, right? You get this minor in Greek, let's say, but then you continue to use it throughout your career. So let's talk about 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, it is really crucial for the idea of the resurrection. Paul describes it there in 1 Corinthians 15. I'll deliver to you or hand it over to you as of first importance what I had received, that Christ died, and he goes on like that. So talk a little bit about that particular formula there, 1 Corinthians 15. Set that up for us a little bit. Why does Paul talk about it in that way?
Yeah, Paul starts out in the first two verses of 1 Corinthians 15, and he says, I came to you, Corinthians, and when I came to you, I gave you the gospel, and no definition, just says the gospel. And he said, if you responded to Jesus, the Jesus of the gospel, he said, you're saved. And if not, you're not. I mean, it's that abrupt in the first two verses. And then he says in verse 3, one of the few times he defines the gospel, he says, when I came to you, I gave you as of first importance. Now, the Greek words there for first importance, most commentators think that Paul is talking about most important, I gave it to you first, as a first importance, is how important this is, not in time. It's not a comment of, this is the first thing I did. He's saying it's the most important thing I did. And then he says, when I came, I delivered unto you what I received. Now, those are two very well-known Greek words. They, by the way, are used in the similar passage, 1 Corinthians 11, where he uses them with the communion, or, the passage there. And he says, I came to you and I delivered, paradoka, the word for delivered there, and he follows it up with paralabon. I delivered what I received. That's a very important twosome for words. Same two words are used in 1 Corinthians 11. And what he's saying is, he's claiming to be passing on tradition. Now, if you read Josephus tells you that the Pharisees, of whom he was one, Josephus, and Paul
too, Philippians 3, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they taught by delivering and passing on data. And they repeated a lot of things. The most important things got repeated. And Paul's all over that because he brings up resurrection all the time. But paraladoka, paralabon, Paul is right in there because those are technical words that the Jewish rabbis used for passing on tradition. So right away you go, whoops, watch out, he's introducing something big. And right after saying that, he says, for I delivered unto you that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, was buried and rose again from the dead and appeared. There's a foursome here. He died, was buried, he rose and appeared. And in those four things, three times this Greek phrase, kai hati, is repeated, and that, according to somebody like Pinchas Lapide, interesting guy. He was an Orthodox Jew with a PhD in New Testament from a German university, Pinchas Lapide.
Wow.
And he reminds us that kai hati was a famous phrase in Hebrew narration for passing this on. So right away you've got Paul saying, perladoka, perlaban, okay, I'm giving you this material. Then Paul says, kai hati, kai hati, kai hati. He died, was buried, rose, and appeared. And then here comes a list of appearances. It's a loaded bit of data that critics started, well, it took them an awful long time to recognize. The first people who are doing this are in Germany around the late 1890s, early 1900s. And by the time we get up to Rudolf Bultmann, that time when I was in grad school, the New Testament critic to respond to, who said the resurrection is a total myth, there's nothing to it. But yet he says that there are many creeds in the New Testament, and he says they came from the very earliest church. You don't hear Bultmann admitting this kind of stuff as a rule, but they came from the very earliest church. But he thought, and this is where everybody thought he went wrong, following his predecessor, he believed that it got to Jerusalem by Hellenistic sources. And everybody's going, whoa, 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 Jewish rabbis are not going to let Greek philosophy set. This is early in Aramaic. And since Bultmann died in 76, Richard Bauckham has done a great amount of work on this. What they've done is say that the earliest creed started from Jerusalem and moved out.
Right. They didn't come back to Jerusalem from the outside, did they?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And one of these scholars said one of the reasons Paul was so angry is that he knew most of the creeds probably by the time he went on his way to Damascus. And he knew the creeds. He knew they were blasphemous. And they led to what we now call early high Christology. Paul hated that. It made all these guys heretics. And that's why he was going against them. And, of course, he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. 3 years later, he goes to Jerusalem. He meets Peter and James, 15 days, 2 weeks. And he gets this stuff. And this same critic who says Paul may have known all these creeds, he says now he finds out after meeting Jesus that these creeds are true. And when he gets them and they're formalized and they're affirmed by the two eyewitnesses, Peter and James, now Paul can write them down exuberantly, realizing that this is what it's based on. And 1 Corinthians 15 is probably the one that gets the most attention by far. And I'll say this thing about 1 Corinthians 15. It has a list of appearances there, of which Paul appends his name in verse 8. Paul introduces it in 3 and 4. And then until verse 7, some people think there's two creeds there. Some people think the German scholars tend to think there's two creeds there. American and British scholars often think it's a unit with a few words added here and there by Paul. And then Paul puts his own name in there in verse 8. Last of all, he appeared to me. Yeah. It's a very early text. And James Dunn said that creed is so early, it may have come in the same year as the crucifixion. Now, that's Gary saying that. The way Dunn says it is, this creed came months after crucifixion. Crucifixion's in the spring. If it came months later, we've got 3/4 of a year to have this thing come out. It could have come out the same year. And a number of scholars have said this creed likely comes from 30 AD. Now, let's say it doesn't. Let's say it's only a year old or 2 years after the cross.
That's still remarkable.
We have nothing anywhere like that. And why is that so important? That list of appearances that Paul gives, there's something about it that's very special. Critics often say the story in the New Testament gets bigger and bigger, is typical mythology as it goes on. Mark has little to nothing. Matthew has a little, but it's longer than Mark. Luke is way longer than Matthew. And here's John with 2 whole chapters. See how it's getting bigger and bigger? Here's a really good comeback to that. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 is the longest list of appearances anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mark.
Yeah.
It predates all 4 Gospels. So if you're trying to say the story kept getting bigger and bigger, tell Paul that and deal with Paul. So starting with these key Greek words, paradoka, paralaban, he's passing it on. That shows it's a creed. Then he says his triple hati phrase shows us a creed. And and maybe I'll just say a word about creeds. There are dozens of creeds in the New Testament, more in Paul than anybody else. Of course, he's got the majority of books, but these creeds are usually dated by critics now. Gerrit Ludemann, atheist New Testament scholar, these are dated in the 30s AD. And that material is invaluable. And somebody could say, well, how do we know it's not telephone tag? How do you know it's not the story getting bigger and bigger? Good objection, except here's the problem. I look at Paul and I say, I wonder why he was going up to see James and Peter 3 years later. He wanted to get all his ducks in a row before he went out and started preaching this. He lined the creeds up, the material he was preaching, with the eyewitnesses. And in Galatians 2, where he makes a second trip, they're specifically discussing the gospel. And Paul says they added nothing to me. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, after the creed, verse 11, he just got done talking about the apostles saying Jesus. And he says, whether it's them or whether it's me, this is what you preach and what we believe.
It is really wonderful. He appeared to Kepha, he appeared to the 12, and then to more than 500 brothers, all at one time, some of whom have still around, others have died. Then he appeared to Jacob, which is also James, right, his brother. Then, last of all, he appeared to me. So he gives quite a list. I've never thought about this. This is longer than, more than Mark, more than Matthew, more than Luke, more than John. Fantastic.
More than 2 chapters in John.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and Paul, and remember, it's not even Paul's material. So right. Paul says in verse 3, this isn't mine.
I've received it.
Paraladoka, paralaban. Right. I got it from somebody else, and I'm giving it to you.
Right, handing it on. Great reading of that text. Thanks, Gary, for being with us today here on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you very much, David.
Gary Habermas is always such fun to talk to. Be sure to watch for his new publications on the resurrection of Jesus. He's doing a big project. Thanks to my darling wife, Kathy Capes, for doing the audio on this podcast. Thanks to our Wheaton-based team headed ably by Dr. John Alansma. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. I bet there's a growing desire in your chest to study Greek, isn't there? If not Greek, then maybe Hebrew. But you can do one, or you can do both at Wheaton College. Down in the show notes, you can find links that will help you get started, and you need to get started today. Today is the day. If you like this podcast, please share it with a friend, a pastor, church leader. Maybe they'll become an avid listener like you. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.